Chapter 7 of Lincoln, a Photobiography. The president's friends were worried about his safety. They feared that rebel sympathizers would try to kidnap or kill him in a desperate attempt to save the Confederacy. Lincoln had been living with rumors of abduction and assassination ever since he was first elected. Threatening letters arrived in the mail almost every day. He filed them away in a bulging envelope marked "Assassination." "I long ago made up my mind that if anyone wants to kill me, he will do it," he told a newspaper reporter. "If I wore a shirt of mail and kept myself surrounded by a bodyguard, it would be all the same. There are 1,000 ways of getting at a man if it is desired that he should be killed." Even so, his advisers insisted on taking precautions. Soldiers camped on the White House lawn, cavalry troops escorted Lincoln on his afternoon carriage rides, and plainclothes detectives served as his personal bodyguards. He complained about the protection, but he accepted it. Thoughts of death were certainly on his mind. More than once he'd been troubled by haunting dreams. He told some friends about a dream he had early in April, just before the fall of Richmond. In the dream, he was wandering through the halls of the White House. He could hear people sobbing, but as he went from room to room, he saw no one. He kept on until he reached the East Room of the White House. "There I met with a sickening surprise. Before me was a corpse, wrapped in funeral vestments. Around it were stationed soldiers who were acting as guards, and there was a throng of people, some gazing mournfully upon the corpse, whose face was covered, others weeping pitifully. "'Who is dead in the White House?' I demanded of one of the soldiers. "'The President,' was his answer. "'He was killed by an assassin.' Then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which awoke me from my dream. I slept no more that night. April 14, 1865, was Good Friday. Lee had surrendered just 5 days earlier, and Washington was in a festive mood. Lincoln arose early as usual so he could work at his desk before breakfast. He was looking forward to the day's schedule. That afternoon he would tell his wife, "I never felt so happy in my life." At 11 he met with his cabinet. He had invited General Grant to attend the meeting as a guest of honor. Most of the talk centered on the difficult problems of Reconstruction in the conquered South. Lincoln emphasized again that he wanted no persecutions, no bloody work. Enough blood had been shed. "There are men in Congress," he said, "who possess feelings of hate and vindictiveness in which I do not sympathize and cannot participate." After lunch he returned to his office to review court-martial sentences. He revoked the death sentence of a Confederate spy, and he pardoned a deserter, signing his name with the comment, "Well, I think this boy can do us more good above ground than underground." Late in the afternoon he went for a carriage ride with Mary. That evening they would attend the theater with another couple, but for the moment they wanted some time to themselves. The war had been hard on both of them. Since Willie's death, Mary had been plagued by depression and imaginary fears, and at times Lincoln had feared for his wife's sanity. As their carriage rolled through the countryside, they talked hopefully of the years ahead. "We must both be more cheerful in the future," Lincoln said. "Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have been very miserable." After dinner, Lincoln and Mary left for Ford's Theater in the company of a young Army major, Henry R. Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Arriving late, they were escorted up a winding stairway to the flag-draped presidential box overlooking the stage. The play had already started, but as Lincoln's party appeared in the box, the orchestra struck up "Hail to the Chief," and the audience rose for a standing ovation. Lincoln smiled and bowed. He took his place in a rocking chair provided for him by the management, and put on a pair of gold-rimmed eyeglasses he had mended with a string. Mary sat beside him, with Major Rathbone and Miss Harris to their right. The play was Our American Cousin, a popular comedy starring Laura Keene, who had already given 1,000 performances in the leading role. Lincoln settled back and relaxed. He laughed heartily, turning now and then to whisper to his wife. Halfway through the play, he felt a chill and got up to drape his black overcoat across his shoulders. During the third act, Mary reached over to take Lincoln's hand. She pressed closer to him. Behind them, the door to the presidential box was closed, but not locked. Lincoln's bodyguard that evening, John Parker, had slipped away from his post outside the door to go downstairs and watch the play. The audience had just burst into laughter when the door swung open. A shadowy figure stepped into the box, stretched out his arm, and aimed a small Derringer pistol at the back of Lincoln's head, and pulled the trigger. Lincoln's arm jerked up. He slumped forward in his chair as Mary reached out to catch him. Then she screamed. Major Rathbone looked up to see a man standing with a smoking pistol in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. Rathbone lunged at the gunman, who yelled something and slashed Rathbone's arm to the bone. Then the assailant leaped from the box to the stage, 12 feet below. One of his boot spurs caught on the regimental flag draped over the box. As he crashed onto the stage, he broke the shin bone of his left leg. The assailant struggled to his feet, faced the audience, and shouted the motto of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. The stunned and disbelieving audience recognized him as John Wilkes Booth, the well-known actor. What was going on? Was this part of the play? Booth hobbled off stage and out the stage door, where a horse was saddled and waiting. 12 days later, he would be cornered by Federal troops and shot in a Virginia barn. The theater was in an uproar. People were shouting, standing on chairs, shoving for the exits as Laura Keene cried out from the stage, "The president is shot! The president is shot!" 2 doctors rushed to the president's box. Lincoln had lost consciousness instantly. The bullet had entered his skull above his left ear, cut through his brain, and lodged behind his right eye. The doctors worked over him as Mary hovered beside them, sobbing hysterically. Finally, 6 soldiers carried the president out of the theater and across the fog-shrouded street to a boarding house, where a man with a lighted candle stood beckoning. He was placed on a 4-poster bed in a narrow room off the hallway. The bed wasn't long enough for Lincoln. He had to be laid diagonally across its corn-husk mattress. 5 doctors worked over the president that night. Now and then he groaned, but it was obvious that he would not regain consciousness. The room filled with members of the cabinet, with congressmen and high government officials. Mary waited in the front parlor. "Bring Tad. He will speak to Tad. He loves him so," she cried. Tad had been attending another play that evening. Sobbing, "They killed my pa! They killed my pa!" he was taken back to the White House to wait. Robert Lincoln was summoned to join the hushed crowd around his father's bedside. Outside, cavalry patrols clattered down the street. Another assassin had just tried to murder Secretary of State William Seward. Everyone suspected that the attacks were part of a rebel conspiracy to murder several government officials and capture the city. By dawn, a heavy rain was falling. Lincoln was still breathing faintly. Robert Lincoln surrendered to tears, and then others in the room began to cry. At 7:22 a.m. on April the 15th, Lincoln died at the age of 56. A doctor folded the president's hands across his chest. Gently he smoothed Lincoln's contracted face muscles and closed his eyelids, and drew a white sheet over his head. It was then that Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton murmured, "Now he belongs to the ages." The funeral was held in the East Room of the White House 4 days later on April the 19th. Afterwards, the long funeral procession, led by a detachment of black troops, moved slowly up Pennsylvania Avenue to the muffled beat of drums and the tolling of church bells. When the procession reached the Capitol, Lincoln was carried inside to lie in state under the huge Capitol dome. The next day, thousands of people, black and white, soldiers and civilians, stood patiently in the rain, waiting to file past the open coffin. On April 21st, a funeral train set out on a 1,600-mile journey to Illinois, carrying Abraham Lincoln home to his final resting place in Springfield. The train followed the same route Lincoln had taken when he came to Washington as president-elect. It stopped at major cities along the way so mourners could again file past the coffin. Where it did not stop, men and women with their children stood silently along the route to watch the train pass. On the night of May 2nd, the train left Chicago and puffed its way southward through the rain across the Illinois prairie. People had built bonfires along the railroad tracks, and they stood outlined against the glowing red flames at every prairie village and country crossroads as the funeral train passed through. At 9 a.m. it approached Springfield with its bell tolling. It steamed slowly through the business center and pulled up at the station, where regiments of soldiers and delegations of officials were waiting to meet it. Tens of thousands of people jammed the streets around the station and stood on nearby rooftops. A military band began to play a funeral dirge. All the bells of Springfield tolled, guns fired a salute, and the crowd fell silent as the train came to a stop. On the morning that Lincoln died, someone emptied the contents of his pockets and placed them in a box, which was wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string. Robert Lincoln passed the box on to his daughter, who presented it to the Library of Congress in 1937. Labeled "Do Not Open," it remained locked in a vault until 1976, when the string was untied and the paper unwrapped as the library staff looked on. The morning he died, Lincoln had in his pockets a pair of small spectacles folded into a silver case, a small velvet eyeglass cleaner, a large linen handkerchief with "A. Lincoln" stitched in red, an ivory pocket knife trimmed with silver, and a brown leather wallet lined with purple silk. The wallet contained a Confederate $5 bill bearing the likeness of Jefferson Davis, and 8 newspaper clippings that Lincoln had cut out and saved. All the clippings praised him. As president, he had been denounced, ridiculed, and damned by a legion of critics. When he saw an article that complimented him, he often kept it. One clipping found in Lincoln's wallet quotes the British reformer John Bright. Shortly before the presidential election of 1864, Bright wrote to an American newspaper publisher, Horace Greeley, and said, "All those who believe that slavery weakens Americans' power and tarnishes your good name throughout the world, and who regard the restoration of your Union as a thing to be desired, are heartily longing for the re-election of Mr. Lincoln. They think they have observed in his career a grand simplicity of purpose, and a patriotism which knows no change and does not falter." Now, there are a few things I'd like to mention to you based on this reading. Again, this is just an excerpt from the entire biography, but some things about Lincoln's life that you need to understand. First of all, Lincoln wanted very much to heal the nation. He did not want to punish the South and make their reconciliation with the Union something that was miserable and painful. Unfortunately, there were people in Lincoln's own government who did not agree with that perspective. And as a result, Lincoln's forethought on the Reconstruction, it didn't happen the way that he wanted it to. As you know from studying Georgia studies, the Reconstruction was a horrible experience for the South, and that was not what Lincoln wanted. So there are some theories, and again, these are all conjecture, that it was perhaps set up by people within Lincoln's own government that had something to do with his assassination. There are plenty of conspiracy theories out there. There are things that they say about John Wilkes Booth that, yes, they shot him in the barn and then the barn burned down and they never found a body. There's lots of things. There are many books that you can look up for this, but one of the things that's important to keep in mind, though, about Lincoln is that while he did not believe in slavery, again, his goal was to unify the entire American country and to bring us back even better than what we were before. And unfortunately, due to his assassination, it took a lot longer. Even though he, freed the slaves, that was, years before the 1950s when the civil rights movement came out. And so it was a long time before everybody achieved the equality that he really set forth as part of that declaration. It was strange, though, that John Wilkes Booth was the person that killed him. John Wilkes Booth, as it says, was a very well-known actor. And it would be like, say, even like The Rock being someone who showed up and shot the president. Most people couldn't believe that it was actually true. They thought that it was all some sort of setup as part of the play. But as you saw, it said that Lincoln was taken across the street and he lingered throughout the night before he finally died. But one thing to also keep in mind about Lincoln was all of the contributions that he made, and the fact that he had great respect for Jefferson Davis, even though they were on opposing sides, and wanted to fix all of the things that were wrong with our country. So you need to think about that when you answer your discussion question about Abraham Lincoln and how he exhibited patriotism as a president.